Thanks for tuning in to the Drive On podcast, where we're focused on giving hope and strength to the entire military community. Whether you're a veteran, active duty, guard, reserve, or a family member, this podcast will share inspirational stories and resources that are useful to you. I'm your host, Scott DeLucio, and now let's get on with the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Drive On podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Howard Farkas. He is a clinical psychologist based in Chicago and the founder of Equipoise Teletherapy. He's also on the faculty of Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine, where he teaches a course on motivation and self-regulation of behavior. He's the author of the book, 8 Keys to End Emotional Eating, and currently is working on a second book on the topic of self-sabotage, which is what we're going to talk about today. So welcome to the show, Howard. I'm glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background, so just people have some context of who we're talking with here.
Sure. So I am, as you said, on the faculty at Northwestern, but that's really just it's more of a contributing services kind of gig. It's not a full-time job. My full-time job is in my private practice, and where I mostly treat people who engage in behaviors that they don't want to do, unwanted behaviors. And it started when before I started my private practice, I was working also at Northwestern Hospital in a medical weight management program with a lot of people who are struggling with obesity and problems that really affected their health. And what I found, I was getting a lot of referrals from the dietitians in that program who were working with people who knew exactly what they needed to do. They had nothing really to learn from the dietitians because they were lifelong dieters. And so I was getting a lot of those folks, and I found that they all sort of fit into a certain pattern of behavior where they would diet, do everything the dietitian was telling them to do, and then they would sort of have a week or several days of binge eating, which they did not enjoy. It was behavior that puzzled them, but it felt so compelling, they felt like they couldn't not do it. It was compulsive. And I saw that pattern over and over and over again. And when I asked them, I would always ask them, like, tell me what happened before, during, and after. What was it like for you? What was your experience? And they would describe situations that usually the triggering situation would be something where they felt stuck, they felt controlled. And often it was the diet itself that they felt controlled by, where they felt that they had to sort of restrict their behavior and restrain themselves, and they couldn't eat this, they couldn't eat that, not because it was a terrible thing to do, but it was just, not the recommended diet.
Yeah.
And they try to be serious about it, but then this would trigger a period of binging. And I saw that pattern in particular happen over and over again. So I tried to understand what that was about. I saw that there was some connection between that self-restraint, self-restriction, and just letting go and doing things that they didn't want to do. So that's what got me started with this.
Yeah, and this whole topic is kind of fascinating to me because you see this type of thing happen, and I mean, I've been there. I'm sure a lot of the listeners have been there as well, where the things that you're supposed to do. If you're on a diet, you shouldn't be eating the chocolate cake and the cookies and the ice cream and all that stuff, but you do it anyways. You have a goal in mind, and you do things that are, you're not going to reach that goal if you continue doing these things. Yeah, fine. If you're on a diet and you have this one cheat day, okay, it's not going to set you back too far. But if you have a cheat month or something, like, that's going to definitely set you back, right?
Right. And the way the pattern went is that, they would have several days of binging, usually 3 or 4 days of binging a week. And then they would be really, in quotes, good about their diet. They would follow everything exactly. And then it would go on again. The cycle would repeat. So it would basically be this yo-yo pattern of dieting and binging, dieting and binging. And what I realized from talking about their experiences when this happened is that it wasn't about the food. It's not so much because they weren't enjoying the experience itself. It was about the freedom.
Mm.
And it was, so if you think about dieting and binging as a pattern of restraint and letting go, then it takes it away from just the realm of eating and dieting. And you could see that in all kinds of patterns of behavior, and particularly self-sabotaging behavior. So one of the things I realized early on is that even though I was seeing this with, this pattern very clearly with the dieters, I would see the same kind of pattern with other patients who were spending money irresponsibly. They'd spend money that they didn't have on things that they didn't even need. And then they would come to me for help. They say, help me do this. And I say, wait a second, you're engaging in these behaviors, you're making decisions, you know,
Yeah.
what do you think is going on for you? So it's not just about food, it's about all kinds of behaviors that people don't want to do. And I found the same kind of pattern that, for example, if people were really constrained with their budget, they would just blow a lot of money, ironically, right? In spite of the
Right.
fact that they were constrained with their budget. And it's the same kind of thing. It's kind of a binge. That kind of pattern I see a lot. It's not, I mean, there are situations where people might think, well, this person is self-sabotaging, and it's not really self-sabotage all the time. Sometimes people, you might have a certain view of what a person should be doing, whether it's, getting themselves promoted in their company or something like that, but they don't feel like that's what they want to do.
Right.
And they'll turn it down, or they'll do something that, prevents them. So it's not necessarily self-sabotage just because it might look like that on the outside. It really depends on the person's experience.
Yeah, and I think you hit on an important point there too, because we started talking about the dieting, the overeating, and that type of stuff. But there's all sorts of things that could
Right.
be classified as self-sabotage,
Absolutely.
like overspending, or things with your career that maybe you're preventing yourself from getting that promotion, or procrastination. Right? You
Right.
know you have this thing that you need to do, but you're just not doing it, and you're putting it off and putting it off.
Procrastination is probably the most common form of
Sure.
self-sabotage. Everybody does it at some
Yeah.
point or another. But also things like, knowing that you had got something important, like an important presentation at work in the morning, and then, you stay up the night before doing something else, binge watching Netflix or something like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, it does come up in lots of different ways. And when people try to train themselves from doing these things, and they try to stop the behavior, they end up feeling like it's a real struggle.
Yeah.
So when I look at different things that, read different books, articles, research on things like procrastination, very often the explanation that's given is that it's some kind of psychopathology. Like there's something wrong with them. There's something, it's a mental health problem. It's a lack of self-control. It's a lack of willpower.
Mhm.
It's, sometimes they say it's a fear of success or a fear of failure. I mean, both of those have been used as explanations, even though it sounds
Sure.
contradictory. But the consistent theme through all these different explanations is that if there's something wrong with you, if you
Yeah.
do this kind of thing, there's something wrong with you. But it just doesn't make sense that a person would sabotage themselves. And so
Right.
that's why they're reaching for all kinds of explanations. But what I realized is that it's not about a personality flaw or character deficit or anything like that. What I realized is that it's a conflict. And it's a conflict between two sides of ourselves. And that really clarified it for me. It helped me understand what's going on. We always think about, I'm of two minds of this, or I did something against my better judgment.
Mhm.
What does that mean? Against your better judgment? Who has your better judgment if not yourself, right?
Right.
So that conflict, I think, is very important to understand, that there's really different parts of that should be working together. And for whatever reason, they work at odds with each other.
Right, and sometimes we are our own worst enemy.
Exactly.
we have this, I don't know what it is inside of us, and we are the obstacle that's standing in our own way for our growth, meeting our goals, whatever the objective is. We do that, and from an outsider looking in on the situation, a lot of times it's perfectly obvious that these things that we're doing, whether it's procrastination or overspending, overeating, whatever, it's not going to help us reach our goals.
Right.
Uh, we can almost always see it in other people, right? It's real easy to point out that thing in somebody else, and you can even go back to the biblical days about this. And there's a verse in the Bible that I remember. It says something like, "Why worry about the speck in your friend's eye
Right.
when
You
you
get the
have a
log.
log
Yeah,
in your own eye?" Right?
exactly.
And so it should be clear that we're hurting ourselves, but
Yeah,
sometimes you can't see that giant log sticking out of your eye when you're
exactly.
looking at that little speck in somebody else's,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um,
Exactly.
so it's just so interesting to me, and I've had this experience, and before we started recording we started talking a little bit about this, but I've had this experience myself where um after coming back from Afghanistan, I found myself drinking too much, sleeping too little, doing all these self-destructive behaviors. I just wasn't doing the right things, and it should have been obvious to me, but at the time it seemed like it was just easier to drink the pain away, numb those feelings, and things
Exactly.
like that. And that, I mean, that's not the right thing. And if I saw someone else doing it, I'd be like, hold on, buddy, you're going a little too far here. But when it's myself, I couldn't really see it.
Right. Right. So, when you talk about just sort of like numbing yourself, there's something about that feeling that is kind of a release. It's a release from whatever pain you're feeling,
Mm,
from the feeling of, I shouldn't be doing this or I shouldn't be doing that. And then you say, well, the hell with it. And I'm just going to let go.
yeah.
And what happens there, and this is actually where I chose the name of the telehealth practice as equipoise, because equipoise means counterbalancing. And that's really the basis for this whole idea, is that it's one thing we all have to, control, regulate our behaviors and hold back sometimes, but we also have the opportunity to let go.
Mhm.
And when it goes to an extreme, when we're holding back too much, then the letting go balances out the degree to which we're restraining ourselves. So there's a balance between restraint and letting go. Now, ideally, that balance should be sort of at the moderate level, in the middle. If you think of it as a seesaw, it's like two kids sitting on different sides.
Right.
They're close to each other and they're in balance with each other. But if one kid goes to the other end, then it's out of balance. And how does the other kid restore the balance? By going to his other end, right,
Right.
of the seesaw. And so they're back in balance again, but now they're in balance at the extremes instead of in the middle. So we always have this conflict between those two sides, between doing what we want to do, being our own boss of ourselves, and doing what's expected of us. Doing what is, either at work or at home or wherever it is, doing the right thing. So, it's not that certain behaviors are inherently bad. It's really about the degree to which you engage in them. Like drinking is bad at the extreme. But
Right.
when you're feeling like you're holding back from all kinds of stressors and pressures or experiences that you don't talk about, which I understand is really an issue with a lot of vets, then letting go, even with something that you're going to regret, is sort of a way to counterbalance, to create equipoise between those two sides.
Mm,
And I think that's what self-sabotage is. I think it's the reaction against too much self-restraint or too much conformity to other people's expectations, and sort of ignoring a reasonable degree of what you want for yourself.
right. So I guess because all of this type of stuff can bleed into all aspects of our lives, our careers, our personal relationships, our health, our finances, and all these other things that go on in our lives. It kind of begs the question, like, how do we address this? How do we put a stop to these behaviors? Or maybe, given that example that you said with the seesaw, with
Yeah.
the two people in the middle, and then they one moves to one end and then the other one has to move to the other end to get that balance again. I
Exactly.
guess that those are two extremes. How do we maintain that balance in the middle so that we don't get too far? And maybe the middle isn't achievable. Maybe we can't stay in the middle, but maybe we can stay somewhere,
Exactly.
not on the far end of the seesaw, but somewhere in the middle of the two sides, right?
Right. That is the key. And that's the key question, really. That's a really important point. How do we maintain that balance, but not in an extreme way?
Mhm.
So, if you think about it, we all have these two basic needs. One is a need to belong, to be part of a social group. And I'm talking about not just, our closest friends, that's of course important, but just part of a society, part of being, just being part of a community in the
Mhm.
larger sense. But we also have the need to be autonomous, to set our own rules, to do things that we want to do and not feeling like we're being coerced to do things. So those two needs, I think of those as the fundamental conflict, right? Those two needs are at the core of this kind of conflict that we're talking about when it comes to trying to rebalance that seesaw in a way that ends up being at the extreme. When we sacrifice too much of our autonomy in order to please other people, to do what we're being told, to do what's being expected of us. And this, by the way, a very important part of understanding people's reaction to dieting, which is how I got started in this, is understanding why people would end up binging when they diet, is that, dieting there are many people who diet, especially women, where there's a lot of pressure
Mhm.
to maintain a certain size, weight, shape, and they feel they don't have a choice. They have to diet. Well, where does that have to come from? Where does that feeling come from?
Right.
It's just pervasive in our culture. And that's why they diet, because it's, dieting in itself is not a natural thing. We, as human beings, we have the instinct that we have to eat. And as people who need to be autonomous, make our own choices, we choose what we want to eat.
Mhm.
But people who feel that they must diet, they have to restrain themselves and restrict, even though it goes against what they want. So they don't eat intuitively. They eat based on what somebody's telling them or what they understand to be the right way to eat. But then there's this backlash against that in order to restore that balance that we were talking about. So this kind of thing happens in all areas. And the core of it is that fundamental conflict between autonomy and belonging. Now, if you think about it, anytime we interact with other people, we're always sacrificing a certain degree of our autonomy, right? You can't have a meeting with somebody without giving up something that you would be doing on your own if you didn't have that meeting. It's just, simple daily things on a regular basis, we're always sacrificing a certain degree of autonomy. So that's what you were saying before about like finding that moderate point somewhere in the middle of that seesaw. It
Right.
doesn't have to be, it's not like perfect, perfectly in the middle. It's just generally overall, it feels fair. It feels
Mhm.
like I'm doing enough for myself, but I'm also engaging with other people. And it doesn't feel like I'm sacrificing too much one way or another.
Well, and just an example of what you just said, like right now, you and I are having this conversation. We're having a meeting together. I'm sure you are a busy person. You have other things that you could be doing with your time right now, but you've chosen to spend some time with me and
Right.
have this conversation. And likewise, I have other things that I could be doing as well, but I'm choosing to have this conversation with you. And so there is a balance there.
Right.
I know that there is a benefit to not only myself, but to the listeners, to you. There's benefits to having this conversation. And when I look at my to-do list, for example, and I look at it and say, okay, well, this fits in because this
Mhm.
this has a greater benefit. And so there is a balance there
Right.
because yes, I am giving up some of my time to have this conversation with you. And I don't mean to make it sound like I'm sacrificing to have a conversation with you, but
Yeah.
in a way, it's like I understand I could be doing something else, but this is what I'm choosing to do with my time right now.
And that's exactly it. You're making a choice because
Yeah.
there's benefit, even though there's some sacrifice. You
Sure.
have to sacrifice an hour of your time or whatever it is. And at the same time, you're making a choice because there's benefit. And that's exactly what the we would ideally be striving for.
Hmm.
So if you think about that trade-off and sort of generalize that in ways that go beyond just, dealing with other people on a regular basis, the same thing would apply then to any kind of self-sacrifice, any kind of restraint that we place on ourselves. And the alternative of being able to be free to act in a way that's helpful to us. And this is one of the things that gets to, I was listening to another episode that you did recently where your guest was talking about being able to be open to cope by freely expressing their concerns.
Yes.
And that really is a perfect example of how best to cope. Because when people don't feel free to express for whatever reason, they might feel like, oh, nobody wants to listen to my problems, so I'm just going to keep them to myself. Or
Hmm.
this will be too much. It'll be too overwhelming for other people. That's a sacrifice that's not sustainable, right? You have to be able to share with other people. You have to be able to, it's part of belonging, where we can rely on other people to listen to us, and know that we'll be heard. And that's really important. And by doing that, there's less of a pressure to find other outlets to let go and just be free to do whatever. So that's where what you were talking about with drinking. I mean, that might be a way, it might have been a way for you at that point in your life to say, well, I'm just going to let go. I can't keep it all bottled up inside.
Yeah.
And it comes out in various ways. It can come out in anger, and it can come out in, just other kinds of self-destructive behaviors.
Yeah, and I never really thought about it in that way of that balance of the
Mhm.
seesaw, but there is that balance because, like you said, there is anger. That was something else that was something that came out, and as soon as you said that, I was like, "Yep, he's got me." But
Yeah, it's
that
another kind of binge, really,
yeah, it was, and I was able to. I don't want to say able to, like I had this great opportunity, but it allowed me to release some of that stuff that was built up inside, and it didn't involve necessarily the alcohol, but it was just a way for me to release some of that tension, the stress, the frustration,
Right.
the anger, everything that I had built up inside of me. It just
Exactly.
I was able to release it, and I know one of the things just going back to something else that you had talked about, one of the things that I think veterans have especially a problem with is when they're trying to reintegrate back into society, that, all these years that they may have been serving in the military, they had a community of like-minded people that they were able to talk to, they were able to uh, share experiences with, and those people just got it. They understood where they were coming from because a lot of them experienced the very same things, or if not the same thing, something very similar anyways. So they were able to do that. But then when they get out into society and they feel the need to talk to somebody about some of the gruesome things that they've experienced or the horrible things that they maybe even did themselves, the death and the destruction and all these things that they've experienced, who are they going to talk to? If you're working a 9 to 5 office job with people who've never served in the military, and you're like, man, I was just thinking about this time that I went into this village and I just killed everyone in this house. And, it's been upsetting me. Your coworkers are going to look at you like, I'm calling HR and I am not sitting here. Like,
Right.
who do you have to talk to? Right.
Exactly.
Um, and I know that's just a random example that I brought up there, but it does go to show that veterans have that problem where they don't have that release of that they used to have in the military, where they had those people who they could talk to, and it wasn't going to upset these other people necessarily. They got it. They understood. Even some of the language that they would use. The way we would talk. We very often we had very dark senses of humor, and that was just common. We made jokes about death and about things like that,
Right.
and it was just a way that we dealt with things. But then come out of that environment, now you make a joke like that and people are going to think that you're nuts, right?
Right. Exactly. And that's such an important point. And it just shows how important that is particularly to veterans who really don't have that shared experience with civilians. To be able to say, "Oh yeah, I remember when I was in the army." And what? you know,
Yeah, right.
and then the message they get, if they don't already intuit it, the message is, "I don't want to hear it. Just
Yeah,
keep it to yourself, pal." And what happens is that to the same degree that they feel that they have to isolate themselves and prevent, you know, letting sharing some of these really intense feelings with others, to the same extent, I think they might engage in self-destructive behaviors. That it's I think and that's where the balance comes in.
yeah,
It doesn't have to be, I can't talk about this, so I'll talk to everybody about something else. It doesn't
yeah,
have to be like a one-to-one, correspondence. The behavior that counterbalances the restraint could be in a completely different realm. What does restraint of talking have to do with alcohol or drugs? But it's that letting go versus holding back. That's the connection.
right.
And that's where, I think a lot of these behaviors come from.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be drugs or alcohol. It could be any number of things. It could
Yeah,
be gambling. It could be
absolutely.
overeating. It could be, you're
Spending, or yeah.
spending, overspending. It could be so many different things, even other risky behaviors, participating in extreme sport kind of thing that
Yeah,
very easily could get yourself injured.
right.
Like, looking at that again from the outside looking in at these kind of activities, you're like, what are you doing? What is wrong with you? But when you put it in this example of trying to find that balance,
Yeah.
there's really nothing wrong with the person. It's just they have to find a way to get that balance without sabotaging themselves.
That's the most important thing, I think, that recognizing that this is not a pathology. A it's not mental illness per se. It's a normal human coping reaction. I could say taken to an extreme if the
Sure.
behavior is extreme and very self-destructive. But to the extent that this is a way of that we're sort of hardwired to cope with too much stress, too much pressure, the feeling of being controlled by outside forces, we counteract that with some kind of behaviors that, even if it's not good for us, and we know that, we'll still engage in it because it feels necessary in order to bring back that balance between those two sides.
How do we find things that are healthier, less self-destructive type behaviors that we can do to maintain some of that balance? And I know that's probably a loaded question because it depends on the circumstances, I'm sure, but
Or
is there a way to generalize that and make it so that we can think through whatever it is that we're going through to figure this out?
yeah, thinking through really is key. It's recognizing that moment. I coined a word for this. I call it regret, which where a person recognizes that if they do it, they're going to regret it. And that kind of self-awareness is really important. If they say, "Oh, I'm already regretting something that I'm about to do,"
Yeah.
they could say, "Wait a second." And knowing this idea of restoring balance, you can say, "What is it that I'm really trying to do? What am I trying to cope with? How am I feeling controlled?" So it's not the behavior itself, like what kind of milder behavior can I engage in? Because, people who binge eat, for example, and milder than that is just eating normally, right? So, and
Sure.
everybody, so it's really a question of how do I sort of down this urge to overreact to the situation? What am I feeling pressured by? What's causing that feeling? And, you know, they might say, well, yeah, well, there's a lot on my mind. I'm worried about something coming up at work. I'm worried about some whatever health issue that I might be dealing with. And they don't want to burden other people with it, and they say, oh, yeah, I really should talk to my wife about this, because I should share, or with my friend, whatever, and let them know that, I'm really having a hard time. Maybe just listening, just having somebody listen to what I have to say, because that's really what it is. It's about not feeling like you have to shoulder the whole burden
Mm.
and then, eventually react to it. But I think that idea of recognizing that moment of regret and saying, what am I feeling, you know, pressured by, that I feel this urge to do something that I know I'm going to regret.
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
I love that word, that pregret, because as soon as you said it, I kind of had a smile on my face, and I don't know if you recognize it or not, but I know that moment. I
Yeah,
know when I was there and I was starting to pour the drink, and I knew that I'm gonna regret this in the morning, but what the hell, I'm gonna do it anyways.
exactly. It's the
I,
what the hell moment, right?
exactly. It's like, you know what do I got to lose?
Right.
I have no other way of dealing with whatever it was that I was dealing with, and but it also, I think, was the easy way out. It was the way that I just found that immediate relief, but it wasn't really dealing with the problem at hand. And that's why night after night after night, I was dealing with the same thing over and over
Right.
again. And I just never really dealt with it in a healthy way. And
Right.
that's what caused this negative behavior to keep happening. Not to say that there's anything wrong with having a drink every once in a while, but not when it's to an extreme night after night after night, right?
Exactly. And that's why I say it's not about the behavior itself. It's not about the food. It's not about the alcohol. It's about the excessive degree of whatever it is. And also, it could be to a degree where it causes some self-harm, even in moderation, but
Mhm.
it's the self-harm. In other words, it's the person knowing that they're going to regret it. I'll give you an example. I had a patient once who had a severe reaction anytime she had cheese or wine.
Okay.
She would get severe migraines. And it was it was pretty, she saw this consistent pattern that when she was feeling really stressed out at work, she would go home, order some pizza, and pour herself a glass of wine. Now, granted, it might not have been 100% certain that she would have that reaction, but she knew she was taking a risk and she knew she would suffer from it. But it was, but not having pizza at all was, for her, it was a sacrifice. It was a type of restraint. It's not that she overdid it, it's just that she knew she was taking a risk. And same thing with the wine. And and it was only until when she understood that it wasn't about wanting pizza all of a sudden, just having this craving. It was about self-sabotage, because that's what it was. She knew that she was very likely to get a migraine headache after that. So it could be anything that is going to have a negative effect, and you do it anyway. And that's why, recognizing, see, that moment that you described where you poured the drink and you told yourself, I know this is not, I'm not going to feel good about this.
Right.
And that's the moment, that's the opportunity. If you can grab onto that with anything, in any circumstance where you know that you're doing something that's just, it gives you that momentary relief. And it's not even the alcohol. People will feel like, oh, well, alcohol relaxes me. It's not about the effects of the alcohol. It's the momentary relief of being able to let go, of being able to tell that part of yourself that's saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it.
Mhm.
Then there's this other part of you that says, what the hell, I don't care.
Yeah.
And those are the two sides that are balancing each other. But you know, it's the reaction, it's the drink or the binge of whatever, binging on wasting time, could be anything, where that's the key, that the person just feels like, well, I don't want to be pressured. But who
Right.
are they being pressured by? This is the other part of it. They're being pressured by a part of themselves.
Yeah.
And this is where there's this conflict. The conflict comes in because there are two parts of themselves that are that have different immediate needs, even though in the long term they're working together. Right? I mean, we all have those two parts. This is not an unusual thing. This is universal. Everybody has those two sides. It's the want to and the ought to, and there's one side of us that's saying, you really ought to be doing this. And the other one says, yeah, I'll do that whenever, right? I'll do
Mhm.
that later. Right now, I want to watch the game. And that's where the the ought to side, we'll call them the manager side, or the future self. There's lots of different ways to characterize these two sides. But like the future self says, you're going to regret it later. I know you're going to regret it. So listen to me now. The manager says, you shouldn't be doing this. You're on work time now.
Yeah.
But it's that side of us that gets very harsh because the other side isn't listening. And, you asked before, like, how do you moderate this? It's really by getting those two sides together as if they were in couples therapy, right? Really. And say, listen, you guys are both on the same team. You're both on the same side. You have the same goals, you have the same values. You just have different responsibilities. One is thinking about what's going to happen down the road. The other is thinking about, so the one that's thinking about what's going to happen down the road is saying, you really should be putting money into savings. And the one that's thinking about what's happening right now is, I just want to let go right now and just indulge. Well, like any couple, they can sort of balance out those needs and say, all right, the manager side, instead of being really harsh and saying you can't spend anything, you have to put it all into savings, you can say, okay, listen, let's figure out a budget. You got stuff for fun, you can spend money on fun stuff and put some of the money aside for savings.
Right.
That's the way to find that middle ground, that moderation, where both sides get some of what they want and not everything they want. And that's true in any couple.
Yeah, and it's a compromise, really, is
Exactly.
what we're looking for. Just like in a marriage or any other relationship, I don't care who the two people are that you're talking about. You're never going to find two people who are 100% in sync 100% of the
Exactly.
time, always, right? There's always going to be that situation where one person's going to want one thing, another person's going to want another, and you're going to be slightly out of sync. You may
Right.
be great 90% of the time, but there's going to be that little period of time where you're not, and you have to compromise. And just like you said, come up with a budget for having a little bit of spending money for those splurge type things. So the right
Mhm.
now, I want to go to the movies. I want to
Right.
buy that, whatever that thing is, and then balance that out with the real need to save money for the future.
Right.
So that way an unexpected thing happens, you still can do the things that you need to do, putting food on the table and keeping a roof over your head. Like
Mhm.
those are real needs. And the right now type of person is definitely going to understand the need to have a roof over your head and food on the table, right?
For sure.
And I look at the right now, immediate, and the future, safer for the future, that type of person. I look at it as a teenager in an adult relationship, right? The teenager is a much more impulsive, I want this now, I'm going to do this now, damn the consequences. And the adult is more of well, let's think about the future. Let's plan for retirement. Let's
Yeah.
think about where our
I,
family's going to be and all that.
I love that you said that, because that's an example that I use all the time. In
Yeah.
fact, the scenario that I really like, and that really I think sort of captures this, is where there's an adolescent, 15-year-old boy sitting in his room on his bed playing video games.
Yeah.
And then suddenly he looks around his room and he says, this place is a real mess. I ought to clean it up. Right. So he makes the decision himself to do the responsible thing. Just then his mother sticks her head in the doorway and says, this place is a real mess. You ought to clean it up. So how does he respond to that? Right. On the one hand, we already know what he wants. And this is such a perfect example of self-sabotage in a very small way. Like, what he wants is a cleaner room,
Yeah.
right? But then he resists the authority figure who tells him he must clean his room right now.
Sure.
And he says, don't tell me what to do. This is my room, and this is I'm allowed to do what I want in my room.
Yeah.
But he already said, he already made it clear what he wants. His mother doesn't know that.
Right.
So at that point, it becomes a power struggle between them. And when she says that, he's feeling controlled. And then he's feeling like he has to counteract that control, bring things back into balance, and assert his own authority.
Mhm.
It's, I know what I want, and I'm going to do what I want when I want to do it. You can't tell me what to do.
Right. Exactly. And it's just such a perfect example. And I think that hopefully drives the point home to the listeners. When you are told to do something, let's just bring it back to the military for a second, because anyone who's listening who's spent even a day in the military knows you're told what to do, where to be, what to be
Exactly.
wearing, what to do. You're told all of that stuff all the time. And sometimes it's like, I just want to get away from this, because
Yeah.
it's almost like a prison sometimes.
Yeah.
When it's like, you have to be here, you have to do this, you have to do that, you don't have a choice, this is the only option for you. And it's like, well, let me tell you something about that only option.
Yeah.
I'll come up with something else and I'll, whatever. And it's not it's not that you don't want to do the right thing. It's just you want that control back. You
Yeah.
want that autonomy. And you start to clash with the rest of the society or whatever that
Exactly.
group happens to be, whether it's your family or your military unit or your job or whatever it happens to be, you just start to clash. So, I think this conversation was really, really insightful. Helped me to open up my eyes into what was going on with me all those years ago, where I couldn't find that balance. I was moving further and further out to the extremes with what I was dealing with. And yeah, it was definitely self destructive. And I was sabotaging everything good that I had going for me. Right.
Right.
And unfortunately, to this day, this is about 12 years later, I still feel the effects of some of this stuff where I could have been further along in my career, for example, or I could have, other things that could have happened. I didn't allow myself to do those things. And now I'm not where I would have been had I allowed that to happen. Right. And yeah, I can look back and woulda, coulda, shoulda all day. That isn't going to help anything. What's going to help something is the right here and now. What do I do now to make that future better? And I think that's a good lesson for all of us to look at.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, Howard, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. I really
Same here.
enjoyed this opportunity to have this conversation. I'd love for you to be able to give the listeners a place where they can go to get in touch with you, find out more about what you do, and also find a copy of your book that you have out now. And you do have another book that you're working on. I'm not sure
Yeah.
when that.
I'm so,
But
I'm self-sabotage. Well, it's about halfway done now, just the
Okay.
first draft. So it'll be a while yet, but
Yeah.
that one's on self-sabotage. So it's basically the same ideas as the first book about emotional eating, but it's more expanded to include all kinds of behaviors like what we were talking about.
Sure. Yeah. So,
So,
where can people go to find everything about you and a copy of your book and everything?
okay, so my website is Equipoise Teletherapy. Equipoise is an unusual word, so I'll spell it out. It's EQUIPOISE, teletherapy.com.
Okay.
And all the contact information is there.
Excellent. Yeah. And I will have links to this in the show notes as well. So anyone who's listening, you don't have to jot it down right now. You can just check out the show notes, click on the link there, and you'll be able to find out more about this type of behavior. If you're experiencing this in your own life, whether it's yourself or a loved one or someone that you work with, a neighbor, whoever it happens to be, who could benefit from learning more about this. First off, definitely introduce them to this episode if you find that it's been helpful for you and your understanding of this type of behavior, but also check out the type of therapy that's out there as well to help deal with that. And that's exactly why we'll have the link in the show notes. You can find it real easily. So I wanted to thank you again, Howard, for coming on the show and sharing this. It really has been enjoyable chatting with you, and hopefully it's been helpful to some of the listeners.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott. I really appreciate it. It's enjoyable talking to you too.
Thanks for listening to the Drive On Podcast. If you want to check out more episodes or learn more about the show, you can visit our website, driveonpodcast.com. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Drive On Podcast.